December 7, 1941, remains a date seared into the American consciousness. The attack on Pearl Harbor was just the opening salvo in a conflict that would redefine naval warfare. The Japanese Imperial Navy's air arm unleashed a new terror upon the skies of the Pacific. This terror was the Mitsubishi A-6M Raisen, simply known to the Allies as the Zero. The Zero immediately established a near-total aerial supremacy across the vast ocean theater. It possessed a combination of incredible speed, unmatched range, and devastating maneuverability. For the first 6 months of the war, the Zero seemed utterly invincible in dogfights. Allied pilots, flying older and heavier planes, could not even hope to match its performance. The morale of the early Allied air groups plummeted with every encounter. The Pacific theater was quickly becoming a killing field for any opposing fighter pilot. The Japanese war machine had achieved air superiority as a critical first step. The seemingly unstoppable Zero had been meticulously designed to prioritize offense. It was a true testament to the brilliance of its designer, Jiro Horikoshi. It flew rings around everything the Americans and British initially fielded against it. A dark shadow fell across the hopes of the Allied High Command. They desperately needed a fighter that could halt the Zero's devastating rampage. Into this maelstrom of destruction, the seemingly less capable F4F Wildcat was thrown. The rugged Grumman fighter became the last line of defense for a reeling U.S. Navy. It was a desperate time when sheer ingenuity had to overcome technical disparity. The Wildcat story is not about superiority, but about a stubborn refusal to yield the skies. The Zero represented a radical leap in aircraft design for its time. Its incredible range allowed it to escort bombers far deeper than any comparable Allied fighter. This extended operational radius was a strategic shock to the Allied commanders. The aircraft's control surfaces were extremely light, granting phenomenal low-speed maneuverability. A Zero pilot could execute turns that would send a Wildcat pilot spiraling out of control. It was armed with two 20mm cannon and two 7.7mm machine guns, delivering a heavy punch. Early Allied fighters were often shot down before they even realized a Zero was behind them. The Japanese design philosophy prioritized lightness above all else. This focus led to the Zero having virtually no armor protection for the pilot. It also lacked self-sealing fuel tanks, making it highly vulnerable to fire. However, these trade-offs were initially insignificant against slower, less agile opponents. The pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy were also highly trained and combat-seasoned. Their early victories were a combination of superior machine and superior human skill. They flew with an aggressive confidence that bordered on arrogance in the early battles. The Zero's high aspect ratio wing gave it an exceptional climb rate in the early war stages. Allied manuals warned pilots not to engage the Zero in a turning fight under any circumstances. A head-on pass or a dive and zoom were the only viable tactics for survival. The psychological impact of facing such a dominant fighter was immense. The Zero truly ruled the sky over places like the Philippines and the Coral Sea. Its speed and grace made it an almost mythical, terrifying opponent in the opening months. The F4F Wildcat was developed by Grumman, a company known for building sturdy aircraft. The design team's philosophy was famously expressed as Grumman Iron Works. The Wildcat was, by comparison to the Zero, a stockier and heavier aircraft. It was slower, with a lower ceiling, and could not turn or climb nearly as well as its rival. Early models even featured a notoriously difficult, hand-cranked landing gear system. Yet, its defensive capabilities were what ultimately saved the Wildcat and its pilots. It possessed heavy armor plating behind the pilot's seat, a critical life-saving feature. The Wildcat also utilized effective self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent catastrophic fires. It was armed with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, a hail of lead often preferred by pilots. These features meant the Wildcat could absorb far more damage than the delicate Zero. A Zero pilot often needed only a single burst to incapacitate an enemy plane. Conversely, it often took numerous hits to bring down the robust Grumman fighter. The Wildcat's strength was in its simple, rugged, and forgiving construction. It was a plane built for surviving carrier operations and sustaining battle damage. Its high-speed dive performance was superior to the Zero's fragile design limitations. This became the only real escape maneuver for a cornered Wildcat pilot. The Wildcat was never meant to outfight the Zero on its own terms of maneuverability. It was a platform designed to endure and to deliver a decisive burst of firepower. This inherent durability would become the bedrock of American air power's survival. The Wildcat was a tough, uncompromising machine built for a long, brutal fight. The initial engagements of the Pacific War were disastrous for the Allied forces. The Wildcat's deficiencies against the Zero were brutally exposed in one-on-one combat. Pilots who tried to dogfight the Zero in a traditional turning battle rarely survived. The Japanese pilots, confident in their machines, quickly exploited every disadvantage. The famous attack on Wake Island saw American F4Fs fight valiantly but ultimately fail. Nearly all the Wildcat defenders were destroyed on the ground or shot down in the air. This pattern of overwhelming loss was repeated across the entire theater. In the Philippines, the 5th Air Force was decimated in a matter of days. The Allied command desperately searched for a way to mitigate the enormous casualty rates. The Zero's dominance was costing the U.S. Navy pilots they could not afford to lose. The sheer novelty of the Zero's performance caught the Allies entirely off guard. Reports of its capabilities were often dismissed or severely underestimated before the war. The lessons were being learned in the most painful way possible, through blood and wreckage. A fundamental shift in aerial tactics was immediately recognized as an absolute necessity. The American pilots could no longer rely on superior numbers or luck. They had to discard decades of accumulated dogfighting doctrine overnight. A new doctrine had to leverage the Wildcat's few advantages, its speed in a dive and its armor. The focus shifted from an equal-level duel to a strategic, hit-and-run approach. Survival became the primary objective before any attempt at scoring a kill. The era of the gentlemanly dogfight was over, replaced by a brutal war of attrition. The F4F Wildcat was affectionately, or perhaps resignedly, called a pregnant bathtub by some pilots. Its wide fuselage and heavy frame were a testament to Grumman's engineering priorities. Leroy Grumman, the company's founder, prioritized simplicity and survivability in his designs. This philosophy was driven by the unforgiving nature of carrier operations in rough seas. The armor plate protecting the pilot was officially rated at 3/8 of an inch thick. This was often enough to deflect the Zero's smaller 7.7 mm machine gun rounds entirely. The self-sealing fuel tanks were composed of layers of rubber that expanded when punctured. This innovation dramatically reduced the number of aircraft lost to fires caused by minor damage. A Zero could often be downed by just a few well-placed hits, turning it into a fireball. The Wildcat, however, frequently returned to its carrier deck riddled with hundreds of holes. Its robust construction meant that even severely damaged airframes could often limp home. This inherent toughness gave Wildcat pilots a psychological edge in prolonged combat. They knew their machine could take punishment that the enemy's machine could not. The Wildcat's slow, manual crank landing gear was eventually replaced by hydraulics on later models. Even with its initial flaws, the Wildcat was an exceptionally stable and reliable gun platform. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns, while less explosive than the 20mm cannon, had a higher rate of fire. A short, concentrated burst could shred the fragile structure of the Zero. The combination of defensive strength and heavy firepower made it a deadly opponent under the right tactics. Grumman built a machine that could survive the impossible, and in doing so, changed the tide of the war. The Wildcat's ruggedness was its silent weapon against the Zero's devastating agility. Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch was instrumental in devising the key to Wildcat survival. He realized the Wildcat could not win a turning fight, but it could use its defensive strength. Thatch developed a revolutionary aerial combat maneuver known as the Thatch Weave. This tactic involved two wingmen flying a set distance apart in parallel formation. When a Zero pursued one aircraft, the two planes would turn sharply towards each other. As the Zero crossed their path, the wingman would gain a clear, uncontested shot at the Japanese plane. The maneuver turned a Zero's aggressive pursuit into a sudden and fatal ambush. It successfully leveraged the Wildcat's firepower while neutralizing the Zero's agility advantage. The Thatch Weave required perfect timing and absolute trust between the two pilots. It was an ingenious way to make the hunter suddenly become the hunted. The introduction of this defensive-offensive maneuver immediately leveled the playing field. The tactic was quickly taught and disseminated throughout all U.S. Navy and Marine air units. The stunning success of the Weave gave the previously demoralized pilots a new hope. It transformed the Wildcat from a flying target into a cooperative, deadly team. Another critical tactic was the boom and zoom attack. This involved diving from high altitude to gain speed, firing a quick burst, and then climbing away. The Wildcat's superior high-speed dive stability made this maneuver highly effective. These two tactics shifted the air war from a maneuver contest to an energy fight. They proved that thoughtful strategy could overcome a significant technological deficit. The Thatch Weave remains a foundational lesson in modern fighter aircraft combat training. The new tactics quickly began to produce a new generation of American flying aces. These pilots mastered the art of the defensive fight and the calculated attack. Major Joe Foss of the U.S. Marine Corps became one of the most celebrated Wildcat aces. Flying over Guadalcanal, Foss scored 26 aerial victories in just over 2 months of combat. He often flew multiple missions a day, pushing his Wildcat to its absolute limits. His relentless aggression and skill were a devastating counter to the Japanese pilots. Another critical figure was Captain Marion E. Tukal, also a highly successful Marine ace. These men embodied the stubborn, unrelenting spirit of the Wildcat itself. They showed that the machine's toughness was an extension of the pilot's sheer will. Their exploits were vital not only for the victories but also for propaganda and morale. The stories of the Wildcat aces gave the public a desperately needed reason for hope. They proved that the Zero was not invincible and could be defeated with superior strategy. The pilots quickly learned the Zero's fatal weaknesses, such as its inability to absorb damage. They also understood that pushing a Zero too hard could lead to structural failure. The aces trained the new pilots arriving in the theater with life-saving combat wisdom. Their combined efforts began to systematically erode the Japanese air superiority. These men faced a relentless, often overwhelming enemy force day after day. They did so flying a fighter that was considered obsolete by the end of the war. The Wildcat's success was ultimately a testament to the courage and adaptability of its pilots. Their legend is forever tied to the rugged, faithful fighter that carried them into the fight. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 proved to be the decisive turning point of the war. While dive bombers sank the Japanese carriers, the F4F Wildcats were crucial for defense. Wildcat pilots provided critical combat air patrol, protecting the American fleet from attack. They were tasked with intercepting waves of Japanese bombers and their Zero escorts. The American pilots applied the new boom and zoom and thatchweave tactics with great effect. They inflicted heavy losses on the Japanese attack groups, disrupting their formations. These defensive actions bought the American dive bombers the precious time they needed to strike. The Wildcat pilots often fought outnumbered, relying on discipline and teamwork to survive. One famous engagement involved a small patrol of Wildcats facing a massive formation of Zeros. The American pilots managed to break up the attack and emerge victorious against incredible odds. The battle marked the first time the U.S. Navy was able to inflict devastating, irreparable losses on the Japanese. Crucially, the Japanese lost 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of their best, most experienced pilots. The Zero pilots who were lost at Midway could not be easily replaced by the Japanese training program. The Wildcat had proven its value by protecting the American capital ships. Its presence in the sky was a persistent, unyielding obstacle to Japanese air power. The battle fundamentally changed the balance of power in the Pacific theater. It proved that the Zero's psychological dominance had finally been broken. The Wildcat emerged from Midway as the symbol of American grit and resilience. The early domination of the Zero was effectively over, replaced by a brutal stalemate. The stage was set for the grueling battles of attrition that would follow. Guadalcanal became the first major Allied land offensive of the Pacific War. The island's tiny, muddy airstrip, named Henderson Field, was the key to the entire campaign. Control of the air over the canal was essential for both sides to resupply and reinforce. Wildcat pilots, primarily from the U.S. Marine Corps, flew non-stop from the primitive airfield. They faced daily raids from Japanese forces based at Rabaul, often flying hundreds of miles. The air battles over Guadalcanal were an exhausting war of attrition fought in harsh conditions. Pilots were constantly fatigued, and their aircraft suffered from lack of maintenance. Despite these hardships, the Wildcat squadrons maintained a constant, aggressive defense. The famous Cactus Air Force, named after the island's code name, became legendary. They fought the Japanese with such ferocity that the Zero pilots began to lose their edge. The Americans were now actively seeking combat, confident in their tactics and aircraft. The Japanese continued to lose their most experienced pilots in the prolonged fighting. The Wildcat's rugged nature was perfectly suited to the brutal, round-the-clock combat. Aircraft were patched up and sent back into the air with incredible speed by ground crews. The Wildcat's sustained performance under the worst conditions cemented its place in history. It ensured that Henderson Field remained operational, a critical dagger pointed at Japanese supply lines. The relentless pressure on the Japanese air forces eventually forced a withdrawal. The battle for Guadalcanal was won not just on the ground, but also in the air. The Wildcat proved it was more than just a survivor, it was a tireless engine of victory. The success of the Wildcat tactics brutally exposed the fundamental flaw in the Zero's design. The Japanese emphasis on range and maneuverability came at the catastrophic expense of protection. A single well-aimed burst of .50 caliber rounds was often enough to set a Zero ablaze. The lack of pilot armor meant that minor hits could instantly incapacitate or kill the pilot. This vulnerability was a constant source of stress for the Japanese air crews. As the war progressed, the increasing number of experienced Japanese pilots being lost compounded the issue. The Zero's light airframe also became a detriment in high-speed maneuvers. American pilots discovered that the Zero could not sustain high G-turns or dives without risk of damage. Pushing the Zero to its limits often resulted in aileron locking or structural failure. The Wildcat, in contrast, could dive away at high speed with relative impunity. The Japanese were slow to address these critical weaknesses in their design. Later models of the Zero received minor upgrades, but the fundamental flaws remained. They never added sufficient armor or self-sealing fuel tanks due to weight concerns. This stubborn adherence to the original design proved to be a strategic disaster. The Zero was essentially a glass cannon, devastating on the offense, but brittle when struck. The superior defensive engineering of the Wildcat created a decisive advantage in survivability. American pilots could return to fight another day, but a downed Zero was a permanent loss. The Zero's dominance was built on a fragile foundation that the Wildcat systematically dismantled. Its inherent vulnerability ultimately sealed its fate against the relentless American war machine. The F4F Wildcat's reign as the U.S. Navy's primary carrier fighter was always destined to be brief. Grumman was already working on a more powerful, purpose-built successor, the F6F Hellcat. The Hellcat essentially took the Wildcat's rugged Grumman Iron Works philosophy and added horsepower. It was designed specifically to outperform the Zero in every single metric. The Hellcat was faster, climbed better, and packed even more firepower than its predecessor. Its arrival in the latter half of 1943 began to rapidly eclipse the Wildcat's service. The Wildcat was gradually phased out of frontline carrier duty on the largest carriers. However, the tough little fighter found a new and crucial role on smaller escort carriers. These smaller flat-tops, known as jeep carriers, desperately needed a reliable defensive fighter. The F4F's small size and forgiving handling made it perfectly suited for these ships. The Wildcat continued to operate effectively from these smaller decks for the rest of the war. It was a dependable aircraft for anti-submarine patrols and close air support missions. The lessons learned by the Wildcat pilots were directly incorporated into the Hellcat's design. The Wildcat had done the indispensable work of buying time and developing the winning tactics. It broke the Zero's back and established the confidence needed for the next generation of fighters. The torch had been passed, but the Wildcat's contribution was far from over. Its tireless service on the escort carriers proved its enduring value to the Allied cause. The Wildcat may have been overshadowed, but its fighting spirit lived on in its successor. The Zero's dominance was a period of intense fear and uncertainty for the Allies. The F4F Wildcat was the imperfect but ultimately crucial answer to that initial threat. It was a machine that won not through aerial grace, but through sheer, brute force resilience. The Wildcat introduced the concept of pilot protection and damage resistance into carrier aviation. Its rugged engineering saved countless American lives during the most desperate phase of the war. It forced the invention and adoption of the revolutionary thatch weave and other energy tactics. These tactical innovations became the foundation for all modern American fighter combat doctrine. The Wildcat had an impressive final kill-to-loss ratio that speaks volumes about its effectiveness. It stood up against the best the Japanese could offer and refused to be swept away. The machine's story is a powerful reminder that technical superiority is not the only key to victory. Innovation, adaptability, and the courage of the pilots flying the plane were equally decisive. The Wildcat was the bridge that carried the U.S. Navy through the abyss of early defeat. It paved the way for the mighty Hellcat and Corsair to complete the final victory. Its nickname, Grumman's Iron Works, became a badge of honor for its durability. The F4F Wildcat is remembered today not as the best fighter, but as the toughest. It was the fighter that truly refused to die, and in doing so, allowed the Allies to win the war. Its legacy is one of stubborn determination against seemingly insurmountable odds. The Wildcat ensured the American flag never left the skies over the Pacific.